taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell us what that opinion is?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
Were there critical points in time during his subdual and restraint on the ground when you feel measures could have or should have been taken that would have preserved his life?
Yes, I do. I think there were several junctures, actually.
Would you tell us about those?
Sure. Well, the first, of course, was to not subject him to that initial prone restraint positioning that he was subjected to. I mean, that is first and foremost. So if that was not the case, I don't think he would have died. The second, though, was when he was in that subdual and restraint positioning, and he was stating repeatedly that he can't breathe, and he was getting a little weaker in his speech. There was one moment in the video where I heard one of the officers saying, I think he's passing out. That would have been an opportunity to quickly relieve him from that position of not getting enough oxygen, perhaps turn him into a recovery position and allow him to start to expand his lungs again and bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So in addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life.
Was there a point in time, Dr. Rich, when Mr. Floyd was checked for a pulse when he was in the subdual and the restraint of Mr. Chauvin?
Yes, there was.
At the time that he was checked for a pulse and he no longer had one, in your opinion as a cardiologist, was there anything Mr. Chauvin could have done at that point in time that would likely have saved Mr. Floyd's life? Well, at the time that Mr. Floyd is determined to have not had a pulse, what is your opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, as to what Mr. Chauvin may have done that would have potentially saved his life?
Overruled. You can give an opinion.
Well, just prior to that point, I heard one of the officers actually ask, actually on 2 occasions, if Mr. Floyd should be turned on to his side. And the response was, no, just leave him. And once the officer announced that he did not have a pulse anymore, I think he actually said he does not have one, was the exact words. At that point, the immediate response would then be to not only relieve him of the restraint, but at that point now you've got to start CPR. You've got to start immediate chest compressions, because we know that if you can get to a patient right away, even when they've lost their pulse, even when they've gone into a cardiopulmonary arrest, there is a significant opportunity to save a life. But for every minute that transpires that you are not performing the basic life support and CPR measures, the literature would suggest an approximately 10 to 15% less chance of survival. It is why we pour so many resources these days into community education and training for bystander CPR, because it's so effective and it works if the person can be tended to quickly enough.
Then from your review of the video, where you could see Mr. Floyd and Mr. Chauvin there on the ground, if Mr. Chauvin knew CPR, did you see any reason from your observation that he could not have supplied CPR?
Not within the opinion, medical opinion, so that is sustained.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Sustained.
All right.
It's not a medical opinion, counsel.
So at the time then that Mr. Floyd was actually put into the ambulance from the scene, in your opinion as a cardiologist, what would have been the prospects of resuscitating him at that point?
Overruled. You may give an opinion if you have one.
So at that point, I think the chance of meaningful survival, unfortunately, was very low because I counted the number of minutes that he was on the ground, pulseless, without any CPR. And by the time the paramedics rushed in to get him and to get him onto the stretcher into the back of the ambulance, at that point, a lot of time had passed. I give tremendous credit to the efforts of the paramedics and the doctors and nurses in the emergency room. I mean, they worked on him for what seemed...
Sustained. This is non-responsive.
Dr. Rich, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd would have lived if not for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of subdual and restraint?
Objection.
Overruled if you have an opinion.
Let me finish my question for you, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether George Floyd would have lived if not for Mr. Chauvin's subdual and restraint of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on the ground?
Yeah.
Overruled. Give an opinion if you have one. A reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Yes, I believe he would have lived.
Last question, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether a completely healthy George Floyd, that is, any healthy human being, would have survived the subdual and restraint that Mr. Floyd suffered during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of 2020?
Objection calls for speculation.
It's sustained as irrelevant as to a general person.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Sustained.
My question for you, Dr. Rich, is would any person, a healthy person, have survived the circumstances or conditions that George Floyd underwent during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of last year?
Same objection.
Sustained.
No further questions, Dr. Rich.